Someone's been reading my mail. The words hung in the kitchen like a confession. I stood there, holding the envelope in both hands, staring at the edge where the paper had been carefully steamed open and resealed. My fingers traced the almost invisible line of glue. Almost, but not quite invisible enough. I was 58 years old and had never questioned the sanctity of my mailbox before. The thought that someone had deliberately violated that privacy made my stomach twist. I set the envelope down on the counter, my eyes moving to the stack of bills and letters I'd retrieved that morning. How many others? How long had this been happening? The kitchen suddenly felt too small. I needed air, needed to think clearly, but my mind was already spiraling through possibilities. My husband, Zaveo, had been acting strange lately. Distant, secretive, always disappearing into his office with the door closed. But opening my mail? That seemed like something from a thriller, not something that happened in real life. Not in my life. I picked up the envelope again. The letter inside was from my bank, a statement showing my personal account. The one Zaveo didn't know about. The one where I'd been quietly saving for 15 years, building a financial cushion in case something ever went wrong. Something like this. My hands went rigid around the paper. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't me imagining things. Someone had deliberately opened this envelope, read its contents, and carefully resealed it, hoping I wouldn't notice. The evidence was right there in my hands, undeniable and terrifying. I moved to the dining room table and spread out every piece of mail from the past week. 10 envelopes. I examined each one carefully, looking for that telltale sign, the microscopic imperfection in the seal, the slightly discolored edge where steam had loosened the glue. 3 more showed signs of tampering. 3. All of them from financial institutions. All of them addressed to me. My chest felt tight. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Zaveo was at work. He wouldn't be home for another 4 hours. 4 hours to figure out what I was going to do about this discovery, and that was the point of no return. I sat down heavily in the leather chair by the window. 15 years of marriage. 15 years of believing we were partners, that we trusted each other completely. And now this violation that suggested something had rotted at the core of our relationship without me even realizing it. The question wasn't just who had opened my mail. The question was why. What was Zaveo looking for? What did he think I was hiding? The answer came to me slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical solution. He wasn't looking for anything. He was checking, monitoring, making sure I didn't have resources he didn't know about, making sure I couldn't leave. The realization hit me with such force that I had to grip the armrests of the chair. I gripped it so hard, my knuckles turned white, my breathing shallow. All those little moments that hadn't quite made sense, the way he questioned every purchase, the way he insisted on knowing where I was at all times, the way he'd slowly isolated me from my friends by finding fault with each one. It wasn't love. It wasn't even control in the way I'd vaguely understood control. This was something more calculated, more deliberate. This was a man building a cage and making sure I didn't realize the door was locked. I had to calm down. I had to think clearly. I had to figure out what to do next. The first thing I did was check the mailbox itself. I went outside, ostensibly to get the rest of today's mail, but really to examine the lock. It wasn't broken. Whoever had opened my mail hadn't forced the lock. They had a key. That meant Zaveo had made a copy of my mailbox key at some point. The violation felt even deeper now, more intimate and sinister. He'd planned this, It wasn't a moment of anger or suspicion. He'd deliberately duplicated my key and then used it repeatedly to access my private correspondence. I pulled out today's mail with shaking fingers. Another envelope from my investment firm. I opened it carefully, right there by the mailbox, scanning the contents before I went back inside. The account was still intact. My savings were still there. That was something, at least. Back in the house, I locked myself in my home office. The one room Saveo rarely entered because he considered it my domain, my private space for work. The irony wasn't lost on me. He respected the boundary of my office door, but had no problem violating the privacy of my mail. I pulled out my laptop and began searching for information about mail tampering, about financial abuse, about what options I might have. The internet was full of stories from women in situations like mine. Women who'd discovered their partners opening their mail, monitoring their spending, controlling their access to money. Some of the stories ended in reconciliation after therapy and honest conversations. Others ended in divorce. A few ended in tragedy. I read them all with a growing sense of dread and determination. I needed to gather evidence. I needed to document exactly what had happened. I started a new folder on my laptop and began photographing each piece of opened mail, noting the dates and the envelope numbers. I created a timeline of when the tampering had likely begun. Looking back at my recent bank statements, I could see small inconsistencies. Charges I'd made that Saveo had questioned, as if he somehow knew about them before I'd mentioned them. He'd been reading my statements. He'd been tracking my spending. The afternoon stretched on. I sat in my office, compiling evidence, and felt something shift inside me. The shock was fading, replaced by a cold clarity. This wasn't a marriage that could be fixed with a conversation. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a breach of trust that could be healed. This was a fundamental violation of my autonomy, my privacy, my right to exist as a separate person with my own finances and my own secrets. By the time I heard Saveo's car pull into the driveway, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to confront him immediately. I wasn't going to let him know that I'd discovered what he'd been doing. Instead, I was going to play along, act normally, while I figured out my next move. I was going to talk to a lawyer. I was going to understand my options, and then, only then, would I decide what to do. Saveo came through the door with his usual greeting, kissing me on the cheek as he always did. The gesture felt obscene now, a mockery of intimacy. I smiled and asked him about his day, listening to him talk about a meeting at work, while my mind raced with the knowledge of what he'd been doing behind my back. That night, as we sat down to dinner, I watched him carefully. Was there something different about him? Some sign of guilt or awareness? He seemed the same as always, tired from work, distracted by something on his phone, eating mechanically while barely tasting the food. He had no idea that I knew, no idea that I'd found his violation of my privacy, no idea that everything between us had just fundamentally changed. After dinner, while he was in the shower, I made a phone call. I'd found the number earlier, a divorce attorney who specialized in cases involving financial abuse and privacy violations. I got her voicemail and left a message, my voice steady and calm, even as my heart raced. I need to schedule a consultation. I believe my husband has been opening my mail and monitoring my finances. I have documentation. Please call me back at your earliest convenience. The message felt like stepping off a cliff. There was no taking it back now. The wheels were in motion. Over the next week, I continued to monitor my mail carefully. Every piece of correspondence from a financial institution showed signs of tampering. Every single one. Saveo had been systematic about it, methodical. He wasn't just curious, he was conducting an audit of my private financial life. The thought made me sick, but it also made me grateful that I'd been careful enough to keep this account separate, to never mention it to him, to hide my financial independence, even when I hadn't consciously realized I was doing so. The attorney called me back on a Thursday morning while Zaveo was at work. Her name was Cariara Weber, and she had a voice like steel wrapped in velvet. She asked me detailed questions about the mail tampering, about the financial control, about the isolation from my friends. She asked if there had been any physical abuse, and I said no, at least not yet, though I didn't voice that last part. She explained my options, the legal protections available to me, and what the process of divorce might look like. She also explained that opening someone else's mail was a federal crime, which gave me additional leverage if I needed it. "You're in a stronger position than you might think," Cariara told me. "You have documentation of the tampering. You have a separate account he doesn't know about. You have evidence of financial abuse. In a divorce proceeding, this will all work in your favor. The question is whether you want to stay and try to fix this, or whether you want to leave." The question hung there between us, waiting for an answer. And I realized I'd already known the answer since the moment I'd discovered that first opened envelope. I wanted to leave. I wanted to be free. I wanted my life back. "I want to leave," I said quietly. "Then let's make sure you do it safely and strategically," Cariara replied. Over the next 2 weeks, I began the careful work of preparing my exit. Cariara advised me to continue acting normally, to not let Zaveo know that I'd discovered his betrayal. I needed time to prepare, to gather all my important documents, to make copies of everything he might try to hide or destroy. I moved quietly through the house like a ghost, photographing documents when he wasn't home, making copies of financial records, building a file of evidence that would protect me in the divorce proceedings. I also started making phone calls to friends I'd lost touch with over the years, the ones Zaveo had systematically convinced me were bad influences or untrustworthy, the ones I'd slowly drifted away from as he'd isolated me. My college roommate Demina answered on the first ring when I called her, and her voice immediately filled with concern when she heard mine. "Briara? Oh my God, it's been so long. Are you okay? You don't sound okay." I couldn't tell her everything over the phone, but I asked if I could visit her. I asked if I could stay with her for a while if I needed to. She said yes without hesitation, without asking too many questions, and I felt something crack open inside me. I wasn't alone. I had people who cared about me. I had options. The night before I planned to leave, I sat in my office and reread all the evidence I'd compiled. The photographs of the opened envelopes, the timeline of financial abuse, the notes about the isolation, the control, the systematic erosion of my independence. It was all there, documented and undeniable. Tomorrow morning, while Zaveo was at work, I would leave. I would take the important documents, my laptop, my savings account information, and I would drive to Demina's house. I would start the process of taking my life back. But first, I needed to sleep. I needed to be calm and clear-headed for what was coming. I lay in bed next to Zaveo that night, listening to him breathe, feeling the weight of his presence beside me. This man who I'd loved, who I'd built a life with, who had violated my trust in such a fundamental way. Tomorrow, I would no longer be his wife. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of becoming someone else, someone stronger, someone who would never allow this kind of violation again. The next morning, I waited until I heard his car pull out of the driveway. Then I moved quickly and efficiently through the house, gathering what I needed. I left him a note on the kitchen counter, brief and to the point. "I know about the mail. I know about the monitoring. I'm leaving. My attorney will be in touch. Don't try to contact me. I didn't wait to see his reaction. I didn't want to hear his excuses or his denials or whatever manipulation he might attempt. I simply got in my car and drove away from the house I'd lived in for 12 years, away from the marriage that had become a cage, away from the man who had systematically stolen my privacy and my autonomy. Demina was waiting for me when I arrived, her face a mixture of concern and determination. She didn't ask many questions. She simply helped me carry my things inside and made me tea while I sat on her couch and finally allowed myself to cry. The divorce proceedings were brutal and protracted. Zaveo fought me on every detail, claiming he'd never opened my mail, that I was being hysterical and paranoid, that I was trying to destroy him out of spite. But Cariara was relentless. She presented the evidence methodically, the photographs of the opened envelopes, the timeline of financial abuse, the testimony from friends about the isolation and control. She brought in a financial advisor who documented how Zaveo had been systematically monitoring and questioning my spending for years. The judge was not sympathetic to Zaveo's denials. She ruled that the mail tampering constituted a violation of federal law and evidence of financial abuse. She awarded me the house, a substantial portion of his retirement accounts, and full custody of our finances going forward. She also issued a restraining order, preventing him from contacting me except through my attorney. When it was finally over, when the divorce was finalized, and I could legally call myself a single woman again, I felt something I hadn't expected. I felt relief, yes, but also something deeper, a sense of reclamation. My life was my own again. My privacy was sacred again. My finances were under my control again. I spent the first month after the divorce was finalized simply sitting in the house. My house now, legally and completely. I walked through the rooms and tried to decide what I wanted to keep and what I wanted to change. The furniture Zaveo had chosen seemed suddenly ugly to me. The decor felt like it belonged to someone else's life. I began slowly, carefully, reimagining the space as something that reflected who I was, not who he'd wanted me to be. I also started therapy. Cariara had recommended it, and I'd resisted at first. I wasn't the kind of person who needed therapy, I'd told myself. But sitting in the office of a therapist named Lena Malone, talking through the years of manipulation and control, I realized how much damage had been done. How much of myself I'd lost in the process of trying to be the kind of wife Zaveo wanted me to be. How much I'd accepted his narrative about who I was and what I deserved. "You survived something," Lena told me during one session. "You recognized the warning signs, you gathered evidence, you reached out for help, and you got yourself to safety. That took enormous strength." I didn't feel strong. I felt broken and confused and angry. But slowly, over months of therapy, I began to rebuild. I began to understand that the violation of my mail wasn't just about him reading my bank statements. It was about him trying to control every aspect of my life, including my access to information about myself. It was about him trying to make sure I could never leave, never have resources, never be independent. A year after the divorce was finalized, I was sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd spread out those opened envelopes and first understood the truth about my marriage. When I opened my mail with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. The envelopes were sealed properly. No one was reading my correspondence. No one was monitoring my spending. No one was trying to control me. I had my privacy back. I had my autonomy back. I had my life back. I'd also reconnected with Demina, with other friends I'd lost touch with parts of myself that had been dormant for years. I'd gone back to school part-time to finish a degree I'd abandoned when I got married. I'd joined a book club. I'd taken a pottery class. I'd learned that I liked hiking, that I enjoyed cooking for myself, that I had opinions about art and music and politics that I'd never been allowed to express when Zaveo was around. The mail tampering seemed like a small thing now, in some ways, but it had been the thread that, when pulled, had unraveled the entire tapestry of my marriage and revealed the rot underneath. It had been the moment when I'd understood that I couldn't ignore the warning signs anymore, that I couldn't pretend everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Today, I check my mail with gratitude. I open each envelope with a sense of security and privacy that I'd taken for granted before and would never take for granted again. I'm 59 years old now, single again, and building a life that belongs entirely to me. Some days are still hard. There are moments when I remember something Zaveo said or did and feel a flash of old pain. But mostly, I feel free. If you're noticing signs that someone is violating your privacy, opened mail, monitoring your spending, isolation from friends, please reach out to someone you trust. Talk to an attorney. Call the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Don't wait until the violation becomes something worse. Your privacy, your autonomy, your life is worth protecting. Subscribe for the next chapter. It's worth it.